The Steam House, by Jules Verne. Translated by Agnes D. Kingston. Book 2, Chapter 5. A Night Attack. The Colonel's unexpected departure made us seriously uneasy. He was evidently still brooding over past events. But what could we do? Follow Sir Edward? We were ignorant of the direction he had taken, or even what point of the Nepalese frontier he wished to reach. On the other hand, we could not conceal from ourselves that, as he had said nothing to Banks about this plan, it was because he dreaded his friend's expostulations and wished to avoid hearing them. Banks much regretted having followed us on our expedition. All we could do now was to resign ourselves and wait. Colonel Munro would certainly return before the end of August, that month being the last we were to pass in the sanitarium before proceeding southwest by the road to Bombay. Kaligani, who was well doctored by Banks, only remained 24 hours in Steam House. His wound began to heal rapidly, and he left us to return to his duties at the kraal. The month of August was ushered in by violent rains, weather bad enough to give a frog a cold in its head, as Captain Hood remarked. But as there was less wet than in July, it was consequently more propitious for our excursions into the Terai. Intercourse with the kraal was frequent. Matthias Van Gweet continued dissatisfied. He, too, hoped to leave his camp in the beginning of September, but a lion, 2 tigers, and 2 leopards were still wanting, and he needed them to complete his troop. By way of retaliation, instead of the actors which he wished to engage on his employer's account, others came and presented themselves at his agency, for whom he had no occasion. Thus, on the 4th of August, a fine bear was caught in one of his traps. We happened to be in the kraal when the shikaris brought back a cage containing a prisoner of great size, with black fur, sharp claws, and long hairy ears, which is a specialty of the Ursine family in India. "Now what do I want with this useless tardigrade?" exclaimed the naturalist, shrugging his shoulders. "Brother Baron! Brother Baron!" repeated the shikaris. Apparently, though the natives are only nephews of tigers, they are brothers of bears. But Matthias Van Gweet, notwithstanding this degree of relationship, received Brother Ballon with a very evident show of ill-humor. It certainly did not please him to catch bears when he wanted tigers. What was he to do with this inconvenient beast? It did not suit him to feed the animal without hopes of making anything by it. The Indian bear is little in request in the European market. It has not the mercantile value of the American grizzly, nor the polar bear. Therefore Matthias Van Gweet, being a good businessman, did not care to possess a cumbersome brute which he might find it very difficult to get rid of. "Will you have him?" asked he of Captain Hood. "What on earth do you expect me to do with him?" returned the captain. "You can make him into beefsteaks," replied the zoologist, "if I may make use of the catachresis." "Mr. Van Gweet," said Banks gravely, "the catachresis is allowable, when for lack of any other expression it renders the thought properly." "That is quite my opinion," replied the zoologist. "Well, Hood," said Banks, "will you or will you not take Mr. Van Gweet's bear?" "Of course not," replied the captain. "To eat bear steaks when once the bear is killed is all very well. But to kill a bear on purpose to make steaks of him isn't an appetizing job." "Then you may give that plantigrade his liberty," said Van Gweet, turning to his shikaris. They obeyed. The cage was brought out of the kraal. One of the men opened the door. Brother Ballon, who seemed rather ashamed of the situation, did not require to be asked twice. He walked calmly out of the cage, shook his head, which might be interpreted as meaning thanks, and marched off uttering a grunt of satisfaction. "That is a good deed you have performed," said Banks. "It will bring you luck, Mr. Van Gweet." Banks was right enough. On the 6th of August the zoologist was rewarded by procuring one of the animals he wished for. These are the circumstances of the capture. Matthias Van Gweet, Captain Hood, and I, accompanied by Fox, Storr, and Caligani, had been beating a thicket of cactus and lentisks since daybreak, when a half-stifled roar was heard. With our guns ready cocked, and walking near together so as to guard against an isolated attack, we proceeded immediately to the suspected spot. 50 paces off, the naturalist made us halt. He appeared to recognize the animal by the nature of the roar, and, addressing himself more particularly to Captain Hood, "No useless firing, I beg," he whispered. Then, advancing a few steps, whilst we, obeying his sign, remained behind. "A lion!" he cried. There indeed, at the end of a strong rope fastened to the forked branch of a tree, an animal was struggling. The fierce beast, hanging by one of its forepaws, which was tied in the slip knot of the rope, gave terrible jerks without managing to free itself. Captain Hood's first impulse, in spite of Van Gweet's request, was to make ready to fire. "Do not fire, Captain," explained the naturalist. "I conjure you not to fire." "But—" "No, no, I tell you. That lion is caught in one of my own snares, and he belongs to me." It was indeed a gallows snare, at once simple and very ingenious. A very strong rope is fixed to the branch of a tree which is both tough and flexible. This branch is then bent down to the ground, so that the lower end of the cord, terminating in a running loop, hangs in a notch cut in a stake fixed firmly in the ground. On this stake is placed a bait in such a position that if any animal wishes to get at it, he must put either his head or one of his paws in the noose. But as soon as he does this, and moves the bait ever so slightly, the cord is disengaged from the stake, the branch flies up, the animal is raised, and at the same moment a heavy cylinder of wood, sliding along the rope, falls on the knot, fixing it tightly and rendering vain all the efforts of the suspended animal to get free. This species of snare is frequently set in the Indian forests, and wild animals allow themselves to be caught in them far more frequently than one would be tempted to believe. It usually happens that the beast is seized by the neck, causing almost immediate strangulation, while at the same time the skull is half fractured by the heavy wooden cylinder. But the lion, which was now struggling before our eyes, had only been caught by the paw. He was decidedly all alive and kicking, as Captain Hood remarked, and well worthy to figure among the zoologist's guests. Matthias Van Gweet, in high delight, at once dispatched Caligani to the kraal, with orders to bring a cage in charge of a driver. Whilst he was gone, we had ample leisure and opportunity to observe the captive, whose fury was redoubled by our presence. The naturalist never took his eyes off him. He walked round and round the tree, taking good care, however, to keep out of reach of the claws which the poor lion struck out in every direction. In half an hour's time the cage appeared, drawn by 2 buffaloes. The suspended animal was cut down, not without some trouble, and we took the road to the kraal. "Truly, I was beginning to despair," said Van Gweet. "Lions do not figure in great numbers among the nemoral beasts of India." "Nemoral?" said Captain Hood. "Yes, beasts which haunt forests, and I have reason to congratulate myself on capturing this animal, which will do honour to my menagerie." Dating from this day, Matthias Van Gweet had no further reason to complain of ill luck. On the 11th of August, 2 leopards were taken together in that first trap from which we liberated the naturalist. These creatures were cheetahs, similar to the one which so audaciously attacked Behemoth on the plains of Rohilkhand, and which we were not able to shoot. 2 tigers only were now required to complete Van Guit's stock. It was now the 15th of August. Colonel Munro had not yet reappeared, and we had not received any news of him. Banks was more uneasy than he cared to show. He interrogated Kalagani, who knew the Nepal frontier, as to the danger Sir Edward might run by venturing into these independent territories. The native assured him that not one of Nana Sahib's partisans remained within the confines of Tibet. However, he seemed to regret that the colonel had not chosen him for a guide. His services would have been very useful in a country with every path of which he was well acquainted, but there was no use now in thinking of joining him. In the meanwhile, Captain Hood and Fox, more especially, continued their excursions in the Terai. Aided by the shikaris, they contrived to kill 3 more tigers of medium size, not without great risk. 2 of the animals went to the captain's account, the 3rd to his man. 48, said Hood, who greatly longed to make up the round number of 50 before quitting the Himalayas. 39, said Fox, without counting a formidable panther which had fallen by his gun. By the 20th of August, the last but one of the tigers wanted by Van Guit was found in one of the pits, which, either by instinct or chance, the creatures had till then escaped. As is usually the case, the animal was hurt in its fall, but the injury was not serious. A few days' rest was sufficient to effect a cure, so that there would be nothing visible when delivery was made to Messrs. Hagenbeck of Hamburg. The use of this pit is regarded by connoisseurs as a barbarous method. When it is merely a question of destroying the animals, any way is good, but when it is necessary to take them alive, death is too often the consequences of their fall, especially when they are precipitated into a pit 15 or 20 feet deep, destined for the capture of elephants. Out of 10, there may be only 1 without some mortal injury. Therefore, even in Mysore, the naturalist told us, where the plan was at first so highly extolled, they are now beginning to give it up. Matthias Van Guit, being anxious to set out for Bombay, did all in his power to obtain his last tiger. It was not long before he had it in his possession, but at what a price! This incident deserves a detailed account, for the animal was dearly, too dearly bought. An expedition had been arranged by Captain Hood for the evening of the 26th of August. Circumstances combined to render it a favorable opportunity: a cloudless sky, a calm, still night, and a waning moon. When the darkness is very profound, wild beasts do not care to quit their lairs, but a half-light attracts them. Thus the meniscus, a word which Matthias Van Guit applied to the crescent moon, shed a few faint beams after midnight. Captain Hood and I, Fox and Storr, who had taken a liking for the chase, formed the nucleus of this expedition, which was joined by the zoologist, Kalagani, and a few of the natives. Dinner ended, after taking leave of Banks, who had declined accompanying us, we left Steam House about 7 in the evening, and at 8 reached the kraal, without having met with any misadventure. Matthias Van Guit was just finishing his supper. He received us in his usual demonstrative style. A council of war was held, and a plan agreed upon. It was thought advisable to lie in wait at the edge of a stream, falling down one of those ravines called nullahs, a couple of miles from the kraal, at a place which a pair of tigers visited every night. No bait had been placed at this spot, as the natives pronounced it useless. A battue recently made in that part of the Terai proved that the need to quench their thirst was sufficient to attract the tigers to the bottom of that nullah. They also said that it would be easy for us to post ourselves advantageously there. As we were not to leave the kraal before midnight, and it was then but 8 o'clock, we had to wait with what patience we might until the hour for departure. "Gentlemen," said Matthias van Gweet, "my habitation is entirely at your disposal. I invite you to do as I intend doing, lie down and endeavour to obtain some sleep. We shall have to rise more than early, and a few hours' slumber will do much to fit us for our exertions." "Do you care to have a snooze, Mauclair?" asked Captain Hood. "No, thanks," I answered, "and I would rather keep myself awake by walking about than be roused out of my first sleep." "Just as you please, gentlemen," answered the zoologist. "As for myself, I already feel that spasmodic winking of the eyelid which is caused by the need of sleep. You see, I have already the pendulum movement." And Matthias van Gweet, raising his arms and throwing back his head and body, gave vent to several portentous yawns. Then, making us a profound bow, he retired to his hut, and was doubtless soon fast asleep. "Now what are we going to do?" asked I. "Let us walk about, Mauclair," answered Captain Hood, "up and down in the crawl. It is a fine night, and I shall feel much more fit for a start than if I had 3 or 4 hours' nap first. Besides, though sleep is called our best friend, it is a friend who often keeps us waiting." We were now strolling up and down in the enclosure, thinking or chatting as we chose. Storr, whose best friend was not likely to keep him waiting, was already asleep, lying at the foot of a tree. The shikaris and the rest were all crouched in their several corners, and no one in the place was awake but ourselves. Keeping a watch would have been useless, as the kraal was entirely surrounded by a close and solid palisade. Kalagani himself made sure that the door was securely fastened. Then, that duty performed, he wished us good night as he passed and joined his companions. Captain Hood and I were absolutely alone. Not only Van Gweet's people, but the domestic animals and wild beasts were equally reposing, the first in groups under the trees at one end of the kraal, the latter in their cages. Perfect silence reigned within and without. Our stroll took us first to the place occupied by the buffaloes. These magnificent ruminants, quiet and docile, were not even tethered. Accustomed to repose under the shade of gigantic maples, there they lay, their great horns entangled, their feet folded beneath them, and deep, sonorous breathing issuing from their enormous bodies. Even our approach did not arouse them. One only lifted his huge head for a moment, and looked sleepily at us, but soon put it down again. "See to what a state tameness, or rather domestication, has reduced them," I remarked. "Yes," replied Hood, "and yet buffaloes are terrible animals when in a savage state. But though they are so strong, they have not agility, and what can their horns do against the teeth and claws of lions and tigers? The advantage is decidedly on the side of the latter." Talking thus, we approached the cages. There, too, all was still. Tigers, lions, panthers, leopards, all were asleep in their various compartments. Matthias van Gweet wisely did not put them together until they were somewhat tamed by a few weeks of captivity. Otherwise, the brutes would most certainly have eaten each other up the very first day. The 3 lions crouched motionless in a half-circle like huge cats. Nothing of their heads could be seen, so buried were they in a thick muff of black fur, and they slept the sleep of the just. Slumber was less profound in the tigers' apartment. Their glowing eyes flamed through the dusk. Now and again a great paw would be stretched out, clawing at the iron bars. This was the sleep of fretful and impatient carnivora. "They are having bad dreams, and I feel for them," said the compassionate captain. Some remorse, no doubt, troubled the 3 panthers, or at least some regret. At this hour, in their free life, they would have been roaming through the forest. They would have prowled around the pastures in quest of living flesh. As to the 4 leopards, no nightmare disturbed their rest. They reposed peacefully. 2 of these felines, a male and female, occupied the same room, being to all appearance as comfortable as if they were in their own den. A single compartment was still empty, the one destined for the 6th and impracticable tiger, for whose capture Matthias Van Gweet yet lingered in the Terai. Our promenade had lasted for nearly an hour. After once more making the tour of the kraal, we seated ourselves at the foot of an enormous mimosa. Absolute silence reigned over the entire forest. The wind, which whistled through the trees as night fell, had now died away. Not a leaf rustled. Captain Hood and I, now seated near each other, no longer chatted. Not that we were becoming drowsy. It was rather that sort of absorption, more moral than physical, which is the effect produced by the perfect repose of nature. One thinks without forming the thought. One dreams as a man dreams without sleeping, when the wide-open eyes gaze far away, seeing only some vision of the fancy. One peculiarity surprised the captain, and, unconsciously speaking in an undertone, as if fearing to break the silence, he said, "Mauclair, this stillness astonishes me. Generally there are wild beasts roaring all night, and making the forest a most noisy place. If not tigers or panthers, at any rate the jackals never rest. This kraal, full of living beings, ought to attract hundreds of them, and yet we hear nothing, not a snap of dry wood, or even a howl. If Matthias Van Gweet was awake, he would wonder as much as I do, no doubt, and would find some long, break-jaw word by which to express his surprise." "Your observation is correct, my dear Hood," I replied, "and I do not know to what cause to attribute the absence of these night-prowlers. But we must take care, or we shall end by going to sleep ourselves." "No, no, fight against it," returned the captain, stretching himself. "It will soon be time for us to start." And we continued to interchange sentences at somewhat long intervals. How long this lasted I cannot say, but suddenly a noise was heard which quickly aroused me from my drowsy state. There was no doubt about it, the noise issued from the wild beast's cage. Lions, tigers, panthers, leopards, till now so peaceful, were uttering sullen growls of anger. Pacing up and down their narrow dens, they seemed to scent something afar off, and stopped every now and again to rear themselves up against the bars and sniff the air. "What's the matter with them?" asked I. "I don't know," answered Hood, "but I fear they scent the approach of—" At that moment tremendous roars were heard outside the enclosure. "Tigers!" exclaimed Hood, running towards Van Gweet's hut. But such was the violence of the roaring that all the inhabitants of the kraal were already on foot, and the zoologist met him at the door. "An attack!" he cried. "I believe so," replied the captain. "Stop, I will see." And without taking time to finish his phrase, Matthias Van Gweet, seizing the ladder, placed it against the palisade. In a moment he was at the top. "10 tigers and a dozen panthers!" he cried. "That's serious," answered Captain Hood. "We intended hunting them, and now they have come hunting us." "Your guns! Get your guns!" cried the zoologist. Obeying his orders, in half a minute we were ready to fire. Attacks by a band of wild beasts are not rare in India. The inhabitants of districts infested by tigers, particularly the Sundarbans, have often been besieged in their dwellings. This is a dreadful event, and too often the victory rests with the assailants. In the meanwhile, to the roars outside were joined howls and growls from the inside. The kraal was answering the forest. We could scarcely hear ourselves speak. "To the palisades!" shouted Van Guit, making us understand what he wanted more by his gestures than his voice. We all hastened forward. At that moment the buffaloes, a prey to the wildest terror, endeavored to force their way out from their enclosure, while the men vainly tried to keep them back. Suddenly the gate, having no doubt been insecurely fastened, was burst violently open, and a whole troop of wild beasts rushed in. And yet Kalagani was supposed to have closed that gate carefully. He did so every evening. "To the hut! To the hut!" shouted Van Guit, running towards his house, which alone offered a refuge. But should we have time to reach it? Already 2 shikaris lay stretched on the earth. The others fled across the enclosure seeking a shelter. The zoologist, Store, and 6 natives were already in the house, and closed the door just in time as a couple of tigers were about to spring in. Kalagani, Fox, and the rest had caught hold of trees, and hoisted themselves up among the branches. As for the captain and myself, we had no time nor opportunity for joining Van Guit. "Beauclair! Beauclair!" shouted Hood, whose right arm had just received a wound. With a blow of his tail a huge tiger had thrown me to the ground. Before he had time to turn upon me, I rose and hastened to Captain Hood's assistance. One refuge still remained to us, the empty compartment of the 6th cage. We sprung in, and in a moment we had closed the door, and were for a time safe from the brutes who threw themselves, growling savagely, against the iron bars. Such was the fierceness of the furious beasts, joined to the anger of the tigers imprisoned in the neighboring compartments, that the cage, oscillating on its wheels, seemed on the point of being capsized. The tigers, however, soon abandoned it to attack some more certain prey. What a scene it was! Not a detail of it was lost to us, looking through the bars of our cage. "The world is turned upside down!" cried Hood, who was almost mad with vexation. "Those brutes to be out, and we shut up!" "Your wound?" I asked. "That's nothing." 5 or 6 shots were at this moment heard. The firing was from the hut, around which 2 tigers and 3 panthers were raging. One of the animals was killed by an explosive ball from Store's rifle. The others retreated and fell upon the herd of buffaloes, who were utterly defenseless against such adversaries. Fox, Kalagani, and the natives, who had dropped their weapons in their haste to climb the trees, could give no assistance. However, Captain Hood, taking aim between the bars of our cage, fired. Although his right arm, being almost paralyzed by his wound, prevented him from taking his usual unerring aim, he was lucky enough to pot his 49th tiger. The buffaloes leapt from their enclosure and rushed bellowing through the kraal. They vainly endeavored to gore the tigers, who, however, easily kept out of reach of their horns. One of them, mounted by a panther, his claws tearing its neck, rushed out and away through the forest. 5 or 6 others, pursued closely by the beasts, also disappeared. A few of the tigers followed, but the buffaloes who had not been able to escape lay slaughtered and torn on the ground. Other shots were fired through the windows of the hut, but whilst Hood and I were doing our part, a new danger menaced us. The animals shut up in the cages, excited by the rage of the struggle, the smell of blood, the roars of their brethren, rampaged about with indescribable violence. Would they end by breaking their bars? This seemed really likely. In fact, one of the tigers' cages was turned over. I thought for a moment that it would burst open and let them loose. Fortunately, nothing like this happened, and the prisoners could not even see what was passing outside, since it was the barred side of the cage which was downwards. "Decidedly, there are too many of them," muttered the captain as he reloaded. At that moment a tiger made a prodigious spring, and clung to the fork of a tree, on which 2 or 3 shikaris had sought refuge. One of the unfortunate men was seized and dragged down to the ground. There a panther disputed with the tiger for the possession of the dead body, crunching the bones in the midst of a sea of blood. "Fire now! Why don't you fire?" shouted the captain, as if Van Queet and his companions could hear him. As to us, we could do nothing more. Our cartridges were exhausted, and we could only remain powerless spectators of the scene. Even this did not last long. A tiger in the next compartment to ours, who had been endeavoring to break out, managed by giving a violent shake to destroy the equilibrium of the cage. It oscillated for a moment, and then over it went. Slightly bruised by the fall, we soon scrambled again to our knees. The sides bore the shock, but now we could no longer see what was going on outside. Though we could not see, we could at least hear. What a hideous din! What a horrid odor of blood! The fight seemed to have taken a still more violent character. What had happened? Had the prisoners in the other cages escaped? Were they attacking Van Guit's hut? Were the tigers and panthers springing into the trees and tearing down the natives? "And all the time shut up in this abominable box!" exclaimed Captain Hood, wild with excitement and rage. Nearly a quarter of an hour, which appeared whole hours to us, passed in this way. Then the uproar began to calm down. The roaring and howling diminished. The bounds of the tigers which occupied the compartments in one cage were less frequent. Had the massacre come to an end? All at once I heard the gate of the kraal slam to with great noise, and Kalagani's voice calling to us loudly, then Fox shouting, "Captain! Captain!" "This way!" cried Hood. He was heard, and we soon felt the cage being lifted. A moment more, and we were free. "Fox, store!" called the captain, whose first thought was for his companions. "Here, sir," answered both the men. They were not even wounded. Matthias Van Guit and Kalagani were equally safe and sound. 2 tigers and a panther lay lifeless on the ground. The others had left the kraal, and Kalagani had shut them out. We were all in safety. None of the beasts of the menagerie had effected an escape during the combat, and besides that the zoologist now counted 1 prisoner more. This was a young tiger imprisoned in the small travelling cage, which had upset over him, and under which he was caught as in a snare. The stock of Matthias Van Guit was thus completed, but it had cost him dear. 5 of his buffaloes were killed, and 3 of his natives, horribly mutilated, weltered in their blood on the grass of the enclosure. End of Book 2, Chapter 5.